Rime of the Frostmaiden, Chapter 6 Caves of Hunger. This adventure in this chapter is written for 7th or 8th level characters. It takes place after the characters have been to Aril's abode in Chapter 5 and likely defeated Yril, although she is not gone forever. It is also likely that the DM may have had her retreat, away from Aril's abode in one of her latter forms and escape to Ythryn. Player characters might come here to try to finish her off, or perhaps they simply take Valen Harpel's offer to try to reach the lost and crashed Netherese city and find out what secrets this ruined metropolis still has. Now, to get to Ythryn, the player characters must venture outside of Icewind Dale itself across the tundra and reach the edge of the Great Glacier, which you can see here in this image, and then speak the everlasting rhyme, or the rhyme of the Frostmaiden, and thus open the crevice and access to the caves within, which do have a connection to the Underdark, I'll note, but are otherwise sort of a prison for a null vampire who is a roaming enemy throughout this particular dungeon crawl. Now, I'll show you the map here for this dungeon crawl. Player characters come in through H1, and they will find the passage to Ythryn through H39. The access to the Underdark is here. You'll note there's a lot of little side chambers. For the most part, everything is on one level, although these chutes right here do technically descend to different areas. If you're using the blank version of this map without all the keyed numbers and locations, it might be kind of difficult to use it on Roll20 because of the barriers right here, although there are ways of getting around that. It is mostly a single level dungeon crawl, and you may note there are a lot of little side areas, but for the most part, the dungeon crawl goes from the northwest to the southeast, and although there's no direct straight line to get there, it is more or less will get the player characters in an oddball straight line to get where they need to go. I'll note, by the way, to get all the way to Ythryn, there should be an additional tunnel that will go on for several miles. If you look at the regional map of Icewind Dale, which comes with the adventure, you'll know that this area is not very large. It's simply the entrance to the tunnels. I would suggest just saying that the actual tunnel that continues just goes on, like I said, for about 3 or 4 miles until it opens up to Ythryn. And going here again, here is the fissure that the player characters should be able to open up, leading into the Great Glacier after, speaking the everlasting rhyme or the rhyme of the Frostmaiden from the Codex of White, the Codicil of White, I should say. Now, as you go through this chapter here, there are some random encounters, all that could be outside the area. Again, the player characters are going to have to reach the glacier. Getting there is kind of half the battle. So there could be some random encounters, say cragcat encounters or yetis and all that. Valen Harpel may be leading the player characters there as she is trying to get there to secure the city and take its treasures for the Arcane Brotherhood. Or perhaps the player characters have found her orb, Professor Scant, while they're in Aril's abode, and it is leading them there. They could also go there on their own, having heard of this location as an adventure location, depending on the player character, the group, basically. It's possible as well that the Elk tribe might lead the player characters there, and they do present that option using Hengar Ainsvard as a neutral good human gladiator, at least that's how it's describing it in these particular rules, to get the player characters there as allies. But they do warn that the Tiger tribe are likely going to be hostile toward the player characters as the Tiger tribe worshipped Oril. In fact, this is a likely encounter on the way, or maybe just right in front of the glacier. They have a saber-toothed tiger, and you'll note they have Bjornhild Solvig's daughter, who likely will encounter the player characters as well, and she's a moderate threat. And plus some tribal warriors, which aren't really that much of a threat. The DM, if you're higher than if the player characters are 8th level, maybe ninth level, you might want to add some additional threats, or instead of tribal warriors, maybe these guys could be berserkers or something similar. But they see the player characters most likely as heretics at this point if they're enemies of a rill. But there should be some threats along the way, or maybe just terrible weather. It could be a lot of things. Eventually, the player characters are going to get to the actual location where you can give them the description of what this looks like. If they have Professor Scant, he gives them little extra information. In fact, he's a great little guide. If they don't have him, it's not a big deal. It just adds a lot to it if they happen to have found him and to the different features the player characters might come across in the caves. It's like additional insights and little bits of knowledge they might find. Now, the floating city of Ythryn plummeted into the Ragged Glacier centuries ago and is just buried in there. Luckily, it's not that far from the edge of the glacier, but again, this is the entrance. The ceilings are generally 30 feet high, although some of them have different heights. It is a random tunnel, so it wouldn't make sense if they're exactly the same height. Most of the tunnels are utterly dark. There are some ice slides as well. The area is also haunted by the psychic hauntings. Some rooms in particular have unique psychic hauntings, and they hold psychic trauma as a result of different effects and different things that happened here or have happened recently, even, or things that have happened centuries ago. They might just see a spirit or some sort of like poltergeist like thing. The DM might even want to throw in a ghost or several ghosts. 2044 D&D also includes a build for a poltergeist, which is a pretty weak enemy, but it would work as an additional sort of random encounter, like encountering a poltergeist in a tunnel might work. The main antagonist through these tunnels is Teleki Lee. He is a Gnoll vampire. I'll note the Gnoll vampire stats are here. It's a great build outside of this campaign just for using Gnoll vampires. There's also some kobold vampires in this area, which are a great version of kobolds, which make kobolds much more interesting and dangerous, especially here. He will likely be found in a very random location, and the DM can roll for this location, and he may be just wandering around. I would make sure the player characters get to at least encounter him before they leave, just because he's such a unique enemy to fight a not a human vampire, but a Gnoll vampire who is more deadly than, or I should say, vampire spawn, actually. So a Gnoll vampire spawn who is more deadly than a typical vampire spawn. So he's a good single enemy fight that the player characters will come across. Now, I won't go into detail about every room, but I will point out some of the more notable rooms and some of the creatures. There's an example here. If Professor Scant is allowed to view the wreckage, if they have him, the Professor Orb, he can tell them some additional information. In location H2, for example, there is the wreck of an air chariot. This is sort of a vessel that the Netherese would use to go from the flying city to locations on the ground. There are some flame skulls here that might be the remains of some mages or whatnot, the remnants of Netheril. And flame skulls are kind of a standard enemy at this point in 5th edition. Here you have some kobold vampire spawn. They're going to be a new thing, and they might be a big surprise to the player characters if they've never encountered kobold vampires. They're less powerful than the standard vampire spawns, but still way more powerful than your typical kobold. There's some ice methods in this icicle drop area, which it's possible that the Gnoll vampire could be encountered here. There's a collapsed ruined tower. Again, Professor Scant can give the player character some additional insight if they happen to have him. There's some interesting treasure to be found throughout these different rooms, and some of which are quite powerful. I'll note my player characters, when they came in, made a beeline almost to the exit. I don't remember exactly which rooms they went into, but they took one way or the other. There's two different routes the player characters can really take, depending on how they want to explore it. But my particular group just happened to make it to the exit. They missed an awful lot of little side chambers and a lot of the treasures that are in these caves. your group might be one of those groups where they do explore everything. And keep in mind, there's an access to the Underdark. If the player characters do want to go there and they go further down, perhaps prep some little Underdark cave area. But the player characters should know they're no longer in the glacier and they're literally underground somewhere and they're in some other area. There are other access to the Underdark throughout this campaign as well. And I wouldn't suggest stopping them. I mean, maybe let them wander in the Underdark and just see how dangerous the Underdark really is if they think they're just going to wander down there. Now, there's some rubble, there's some information on Mistril, the first version of Mistra, including some, extra treasure stuff in the area. There's an Arcane Eye activator. This essentially allows them to kind of get a view of what Ythryn looks like, or at least to a certain extent. They use this thing. There is this thing right here. This is actually the head of an iron giant that is still partially functioning. The only thing that works on it are the eyes. They can flicker and use the equivalent of Morse code. This is kind of like a role playing situation, but it's going to take a fairly intelligent player character or someone who's can pick up on what's happening here to realize that they can communicate with this thing. Also, Professor Scant will definitely help with Gollum's head, is what it is, in understanding what this thing is saying. It does have some information, but not a lot. The adventure also notes the Netherese tongue, which is called Loros. It's based more on Elvish and is written in Draconic. If anyone who can speak Elvish can essentially understand it, you can think of it like the difference if Elvish was Latin and Loros is French. It's somewhat understandable, although you wouldn't understand the every little nuance in the language. You might be able to understand what someone is saying, and although it'd be a little bit maybe a little difficult. In addition, there's another toppled spire, more treasure, things like that, and it just keeps going through here. Standard enemies like shadows, things like that. There are some interesting rooms, though, like this Curse of Hunger. When the player characters get here, they feel an intense hunger, which thus the name, the Caves of Hunger, also because of the vampires who hunger for blood. Even after leaving the cave, eating a handful of food keeps the hunger at bay for an hour. But if the hunger isn't satisfied in 1 minute, the creature has to make a Constitution saving throw or gain a level of exhaustion from hunger. And this could be quite dangerous if it goes wrong. I'll just say that. I'll let you as a DM or player character read this on your own. There is some decent artwork, by the way. This is of this is actually the Null vampire, uh, Tekeli Lee in his hyena form, approaching someone in the caves, which stalking someone in the caves and all that. There's some other interesting locations. There's a little bit of variety in this dungeon crawl. It's not straightforward. The chambers tend to be different sizes and different shapes. There are some different choices. A very kind of bad dungeon crawl would have just a straight line with no real choices. This has several choices. There are some dead ends. One way or another, it will get the player characters where they need to go, but they do get to they get to explore. And a good adventure gives the player characters decisions to make and consequences to those decisions, as well as a good dungeon crawl is going to have some very interesting areas, unique enemies, unique situations, which this dungeon crawl does actually have. Now, as you're going further, there is let me see if this is the location I'm thinking about here. Curse of Hunger. What's a different one? There's just some interesting location here. This is a domed ceiling chamber. There are just, different things you will find here. I'm not going to go into every detail of every room. Again, another psychic haunting area in this particular cave. If the player characters have the Slade host background, this is a good time to have it burst out of their chest in a terrifying way. More kobold vampire spawn, possibly maybe even bring in the Null vampire in this location if you want to make that really difficult. One of the unique enemies you'll find here is the snow golems. They are golems made of snow that are sort of lesser golems, but still a unique creature that the player characters almost certainly would not have encountered before. And again, the Den of Death, which is a just a place where more enemies could be. There's slippery ice, it stinks of death in that room. The ice crypt, nothing particularly special there. A frozen frost giant in the ice. The DM could have this be a frost giant skeleton if you want. If you want to add additional encounter. There's the borehole has more psychic hauntings. There's a chart for it earlier, and again in 5e tools you could hover over it. It gives you information. There is a young Remor has to be encountered here, and this is one of those possible locations where the Null Vampire shows up. Remor has eggs. You'll note, by the way, these are the Remor has tunnels over here. I think that's number 24, actually. 23, close enough. The adult Remor has is located in 24. This should be a pretty dangerous encounter by itself. It's a solo enemy fight, but still, it's a big monster fight, which gives some variety to the sizes and types of monsters to be found here. And again, this thing essentially has its tunnels access the Underdark, and that's maybe where one of the places it goes for food and to, eat actual kobolds or random orcs in different tunnels. Again, here's the access to the Underdark, Egg Chamber, Psychic Hauntings there. Some information Professor Scant can find out about these some statues found here. There is some drow elite warriors and a drow mage to be found. I'll note if you're using 2024 rules and in 5e tools right here, if you hover over drow mage, it's going to give you the bandit deceiver stat block. This is not the same as it was in 2014. I would recommend just using the 2014 drow mage instead. You can still find the stats online. And the elite drow warriors, it's suggesting using a gladiator, but in 2025, but you could just simply use the drow elite warriors from 2014. They probably work better. I don't think this is a wise move to just suggest these things because it doesn't really compare very well for the most part. At least they kind of give some extra spells to the bandit deceiver, I think, but to me it pales in comparison. There's also a shadow demon that could also be brought in. You get more of a drow outpost, and the drow have come in from the Underdark and found this place, and they have a minor magic item, a thermal cube to keep the area warm. There's a spell book for mages. Um, some other mildly interesting things as the player characters are coming through here. Let me see here. There's a spear that might be magical or might have a some connection to the Chosen of Thrym. There's a lot of little kind of what you might call fluff things in here as well, like little connections to different stories that are brought into this campaign. That might be one of those right there. One of the more interesting locations is the Thing in the Ice. I feel like this ties in a little bit to the movie The Thing and the being in the middle of a frozen wasteland and dealing with sort of an alien threat. On the map, it depicts it as being sort of a cosmic horror type thing from like Lovecraftian or some sort of monstrous squid creature. It doesn't have to be that kind of thing. The player characters don't encounter it directly, but if they're in the area, they might have to save versus a dominate monster effect. And it's interesting because it will basically scan the player character's mind and they'll be kind of hovering there for like a full hour. During this time, the player characters make an intelligence save. At the end of the hour, they take a ridiculous amount of psychic damage or half on a pass as it just invades their mind, trying to learn what they are. And whether they save or pass, they are likely to gain some long term madness effects. And again, these effects are from the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide, despite the fact that most of 5e Tools is using 2025 rules. It has no version of this in 2025 for some reason. So just use these rules for long term magics from 2014. Now, we do get some other areas, the mirrored cavern, for example, the possible location of the Null Vampire. There's a mummy dressed in tattered robes with a golden face mask that is sort of a remnant, I believe, from Netherese and all that. More debris from the city. There's a spitting mimic, another, I believe they actually brought this in for this adventure or updated it for this adventure from an older edition. It's another moderately unique creature in this adventure. One of the more interesting locations, again, is the Frozen Grove. This is essentially a group of trees that still grow down here despite the cold, and they grow these like purple pear because they're pear trees that were enchanted by Netherese arcanist to endure high altitude and harsh winter. Now, they thrive even in these icy caverns, and there's even a dryad who dwells within the grove. And if the player characters take some of the fruit, they can do various different things depending on they grant charms. The player characters are were to eat them depending on what they eat. It's very random, and I don't think they're going to last forever as they are fruit that will rot eventually. So player characters can't just take tons of them and expect them to sit in a bag of holding for months on end. They will rot at that point and lose their value and their abilities. But it's a great little extra thing to give the player characters right before they head into the tunnels to reach Ythryn, where there is an awful lot of dangerous things. Now, there are some Nothics here who are, of course, weird, and they are the remnants, I believe, of mages from mages from Ythryn who took reference here. Actually, they might be. I stand corrected. They're actually evil denizens, evil denizens of Ythryn, and I there is a creature here that is a drow who was in the Druid's Grove, and it's complicated. Nonetheless, there is some additional insight that Professor Scant can give the player characters. There's Ice Cave, and finally, the passage that leads to Ythryn itself, which it says it goes on for a mile before ending in a great ice cavern. Again, if you look at the full map of Icewind Dale, which I can go back here and see if I can find it for you guys, you'll notice something about that map. See if I can dig it up here. Mostly because of the overall scale of how much distance the player characters need to cross. Here it is right here. So, for example, here's the Caves of Hunger right here. Here's Ythryn. And if I look, I don't know if it shows the. Hold on 1 second. Let me go back here. Let me go open perhaps this version. It doesn't have the distances. Okay. Nonetheless, there is quite a difference or quite a distance between the Caves of Hunger and Ythryn. I don't know if this has a scale on it, but if you give this map a scale, you'll realize that you can measure the difference between Targos and Bryn Chandler. I believe it's actually a couple of miles distance right here. A mile to Ythryn is only from here to maybe where it says the six in chapter six. So this tunnel is way longer than that, which makes no sense that they say it's just a mile. It's way further. You could even add some additional locations on the way through an ice tunnel. The DM could even have a few splits going off in random directions, like maybe side tunnels that are just get the player characters lost. I feel like there's such a distance that the player characters could encounter a lot of things in these much longer tunnels. Because again, this is way more than a mile to get there. Anyway, that's probably one of the only flaws in this particular chapter that I can really criticize about the whole chapter, other than the fact that the player characters could sort of run through this particular chapter and skip an awful lot of it. This did happen with my group, and that the adventure being a dungeon crawl is a mostly single level dungeon crawl. It'd be interesting if it had some sub levels that perhaps over on the right side of the screen that the player characters could come across that might be just a little more interesting, like little side areas on top of the side areas. I'll show you what I mean here. Like, for example, like if they came to this chamber here and there was like maybe a little sub area that could only be accessed to this area that maybe goes above it and reconnects to over here, or maybe there's a little this tunnel like here goes up into a little side cavern and it reconnects to some random area. That might make it this dungeon crawl a little more three-dimensional and a little more interesting to explore. Now, the interesting thing about it, it does have some very unique locations and some unique monsters about it that most dungeon crawls don't have. It is a fairly good higher level dungeon crawl, and it definitely leads up to the final chapter very well. It just has a few minor flaws, and it has the design flaw of the designer saying it only takes a mile. There's only a mile tunnel up ahead. No, it's not. It's much longer. And that's really my only criticism for this particular adventure. I would overall say that the Caves of Hunger are a 4.5 out of 5 when it comes to a D&D adventure. Now, guys, if you like this review, you want to see more of them, and you want to see the other reviews I've done for Icewind Dales, please like this video and subscribe for additional content.